Welcome to the last video in this mini series on the English defence, this exciting opening that we've been looking at where black goes e6 and b6 at the correct moment. So called the English defence because it's been named after a number of English grandmasters, Tony Miles most notably, but also Raymond Keane, Spielman, Julian Hodgson, myself. I've played this on a regular basis. So it's really a number of English players made this popular. But if you look through history and look at other players that played this opening, you can include the likes of Spassky, nowadays Jabava, Nigel Short is another player. Lots of top players have used this opening. And in this last video, we're just going to have a look at other things you may encounter. And this is when we're not necessarily look at white playing e4, the most critical move. So I just want to make sure you're not going to be tricked out in the opening. And there are a couple of points that might be a little bit annoying for us in this opening that we need to deal with. And okay, well, let's go into the action. So obviously, I wouldn't recommend you play the English defence against e4, and I've spoke about this before, and reasoning why I don't recommend you play this setup against e4. I generally like having my pawn on b6 only when white has a pawn on c4. Look back at my previous videos to see why. So d4, I will start with e6, and again here, to give you a full repertoire, what I'd recommend you do is prepare yourself for the French defense, and the next set of videos I'm going to do will be on the French defense, and then you'll be fully prepared. And also check out some of my videos on the Dutch opening, because there are times when that would be useful for this move order. Now, what happens if white does not play 2c4 here? Well, this is a good question, and there are two moves which can be a little bit annoying to us. And those moves are the moves at g3 and the move knight to f3. Now, the problem with g3 is that if we go b6, we're obviously going to get targeted very quickly on the long diagonal. So this doesn't really seem to work too well for us, b6. So after the move g3, I'm going to give you two recommended ways of playing. I say you either learn the Dutch defense, and you can check my videos out on this, because I'll be honest, g3 is a very rare move. Or if you want to try to take advantage of your opponent not playing a pawn move in the center of the board, you can try to strike out with the move c5. And this would probably be my recommended way of playing, because g3 is not a common move, and to take advantage of the fact that white hasn't played a move in the center, we can strike out with c5. And the point being, if white plays a move like knight to f3, we can strike out first of all with knight to c6, and then we can just play simple moves like d5 and gain this space in the center of the board. So against g3, I recommend you check out the move 2c5, and then you'll be pretty much out of main theoretical lines already. Now, what about knight to f3? I mean, I'll be honest, this is another slightly annoying move for our opening, because if you want to try to play the English defense, my recommended way of playing was you only play b6 when white goes c4. So it's all about the move order here. I mean, I've played b6 a number of times here. This has been one of my main options here. But now white should play e4. And we get now a hippopotamus opening, an opening I discussed in a video a couple of videos ago, where we can go bishop to b7. Our opponent defends the pawn on e4. But this is a little bit different to the English defense, because white's pawn is still on c2. And now stage 2, the English defense, bishop to b4 check, does not work so successful here because of c3. And there's two ways you can play this position. Now, number one way is to play the hippopotamus, a very easy opening to learn. And there was a game, Aronian versus Luke and Shane from England, where Luke played g6. And the point of this setup is to fianchetto both bishops, put both of your knights in front of your king and queen, and keep things very flexible. For example, the game Aronian played normal moves, rook e1, and here we see Luke going for the so-called hippopotamus setup. And this here is the hippopotamus, this setup you see here from black. And it's a very solid opening. Normally, you want to try to play the move f5 later on, once you've castled, or even e5. And it's something that you might be comfortable playing, you may not be comfortable playing. Give this a go in some practice games first. I like this setup and I'm quite happy playing the setup, but other people might think it's a little bit too cramped for black. So that's option one. Now, option two, after the move knight to f3, is to play b6, e4, bishop to b7, bishop to d3, and now to strike out against the center as quickly as you can. And Tony Mars was a fan of the move c5 here. And he had a couple of games. I mean, one game he played went c3. And here, Tony always tried to now attack the e4 pawn with his knight. So he did simple development, trying to pressurize this pawn. And the idea is, if white pushes on with e5, our knight comes into d5 and sits on that square. And if white tries to keep the center closed down, Tony finished bishop e7, so simply developed. And after castles, he brought his other knight out. And he played this very flexible setup here, where he's got a little bit more space. He wants in this position to take on d4, and then go knight to b4 if white's not careful. Let's say white plays a move like bishop to e3. Well, now Tony wants to take on d4 and go knight to b4. And this is his main threat. This is a very nice position for black because you are threatening the pawn on e4. You want to get rid of your opponent's bishop. And your English defense bishop on b7 is a very good piece. So Tony was quite a big fan of this type of sort of development. And you have these two choices if you want to stick to the English defense pure after the crafty move order knight to f3. Now, the reason at the start I said, this might not be up your street is that I often in this move or personally play f5 and go into a Dutch opening, which there are videos on here you can look at as well if you're not happy with the English defense. So these are all crafty move order options, and they're quite hard, I admit, for beginners to grasp, but you will get used to them. You just have to think very slowly at the start of the game and adjust quickly to the way that your opponent's playing. Now, what else can be played after e6 here? What other move order things do we have to look out for? Well, let's say white does go c4. Well, now b6 is clearly the recommended move. And we are now going to look at positions where white doesn't go e4 in this, and he doesn't necessarily go d5. So, for example, something like knight to f3. Well, we do stage one, bishop to b7, and we now go for the following plan, bishop b4 and f5 anyway. It makes a lot of sense if white's not going to go e4 to develop the bishop on f1 to g2, so g3. And now a good plan here, stage two, bishop to b4, check. And there's a couple of ways black can play this now. After something like bishop to d2, well, I recommend we get rid of those bishops. And here, what is our crowbar move? We have to strike out, get control of the all-important e4 square, f5. And now, after some normal developing moves, knight to f6, both sides castle. We have good control of this square on e4 now. And after a move like queen to c2, this is a middle game position now. So this is why looking at my Dutch videos will help you learn more about this opening as well, because this does resemble a Dutch opening, except we have our bishop on b7, which can be quite handy for us. And here, a typical idea in a Dutch opening is queen to e8. I really like this maneuver. Try to get the queen to h5 to start an attack against the white king. After something like rook to e1, bring that queen into the game, queen to h5, and black is already starting to attack in this position with ideas of knight to g4 at some point, even g5, even f5. Attack, attack, attack. So let's just go through that again. So this is with knight to f3. We play the move bishop to b7 after that, and now g3. Stage two, we check on b4. Now, what else can white block with here? Well, he can block with a knight. He can also block maybe knight to c3. And now we go for our hold on the e4 square. So we should play f5 as always. And after bishop g2, knight to f6. Now white castles. Now, as soon as white castles, I think this is an important time to have a little think, because I always play bishop takes c3 here. now that white can move his knight somewhere, I mean, white can move this knight if he wishes away, and then we won't be able to double his pawns. So when the timing comes, when that position comes where he might be able to move his knight, I always take the knight off the board because this increases my control of the e4 square. And all these variations where white doesn't put a pawn on e4, it's about us, black, controlling that e4 square. And if you like, in the whole of the English defense, it's all about the e4 square. So by giving up our dark square bishop for the knight on c3, we increase our control of that square. And now a very important move. After b takes c3, what should you be playing here? Have a little think about this position. And this is a key idea in this particular position here. It's about this e4 square. Now, what would you play in this position? And I'll give you a clue. One of your pieces should go to that square. Which piece should it be? Well, I believe as soon as you've got rid of the knight on c3, as soon as that knight is not controlling e4 anymore, I always put my bishop upon that square. Why do I do that? Well, I'm a little bit afraid in some variations, if we castle, first of all, that white might play the move d5. This is a move to watch out for. So beware of the move d5 when both sides have fianchettoed like this. Because if you take on d5, white can often play knight takes d4, knight to d4, and white is the one with a pin on the d5 pawn. And these positions get a little bit tricky. I want to stop all of these ideas by playing my bishop to e4 first. So the move d5 now from white makes little sense because our bishop is not going to be trapped in anymore. If white ever moves the knight on f3, well, we can swap off light square bishops, and here we can continue simply with our ideas of castles, queen e8, queen h5 with some kind of attack. Now, I always put my bishop on e4 and not my knight. Why is that? Well, the problem is, again, to do with this kind of bishop on g2. If we put our knight on e4, it can often become in a nasty pin. Not here, because knight takes c3 is a ploy that we're trying to use. But after something like queen c2, let's say black castles, you have to watch out for the dangerous move knight to d2. And now look at the pressure white has with the piece on e4. This knight on e4 will struggle to move, and indeed you could end up in a very bad position quickly here. So I don't like playing in this manner. So a key point is, if you get your bishop b4 check in these lines, and white has fianchettoed his kingside, if white replies with knight to c3, then we should take that knight at some point, continue with f5, and plonk our bishop onto this very, very nice square in the center of the board. So that's my way of playing this. So let's just have a look. Other setups again. So there's a lot to take in here. I mean, there was a game, Spielman, where this actually occurred in a Spielman game. So let's just see how Spielman played this with black. And that continued, knight to c3 now. So white didn't play g3 first. Again, it's flexible move orders. We do our stage 2 now. We go bishop to b4. And here, instead of fianchettoing, we've seen what we should do against that. White decided to play e3. So white wants to put his bishop on d3. So does this make any difference? Well, in actual fact, I think this is a much superior setup for black now. And what should we always do when white does not go e4? We have to try to gain maximum control of the e4 square. f5, correct way to play. White played bishop to d3. Knight to f6, increasing our control over that square. White castled. Now, in actual fact, if this was me here, I would have stuck to the rule I told you about before. Now that white has castled, the knight on c3 may move, and I would have played bishop takes c3 in this position. But Spielman instead castled first, and now after bishop d2, he took on c3 here, which doesn't allow the doubling of pawns, but it still has the same idea to keep control of the e4 square. And now, again, I'm going to give you your second question. What piece should you put on e4? And it's slightly different now. Before, I said we shouldn't put the knight on e4. Why did I say you shouldn't put the knight on e4? Well, My reasoning was if your knight goes to e4 when white has a fianchettoed bishop on g2, the knight on e4 can become in a nasty pin. Now, clearly that is not the case here because white hasn't fianchettoed the pawn on g3. So in these positions where white hasn't fianchettoed, we don't have to fear a pin on the h1, a8 diagonal. So I think we should go knight to e4. And this is the way I like playing these positions. And the game continued. Spielman's game after knight to e4, queen to e2. A couple of ideas here. If you want to be really brave, you could even go for the rook swing. Rook f6, rook to g6, rook to h6, and try to attack like this. I've used this idea on many occasions when I have a pawn on f5. Spielman preferred to develop his pieces in a sensible manner. In these variations, your knight on b8 can be a problem piece. I'd always recommend, if you can play it, to go d6 and knight d7. When you develop your pieces, always try to think where they're best placed. Now, I wouldn't necessarily want to put it on c6 because it blocks my bishop on b7 in. So Spielman continued d6, knight d2 was played, trying to take control of the e4 square. Spielman just went knight d7 anyway, f3, he took on c3, and now he went e5, gaining space in the center of the board. e4 is not something we've got control of, but we are pushing forwards with e5. White has double pawns. Black was slightly better in this structure, and this is a very, very comfortable position for black here. Very comfortable position for black. Better for black. Okay, so really, they're the main ideas that we should bear in mind in a lot of these positions when white plays in this manner. So this is after d4, e6, c4, b6, and white doesn't play the move e4. So we still do our same plan, but it's about controlling this e4 square. Now, just to give you kind of as much of an overview of this opening as I can, I should also mention what happens if white plays the English opening. Can you still do the same thing? Well, yes, of course you can. Against the English opening, when white goes c4, you can play b6 immediately. And now, what happens if white tries to avoid playing d4, for example? Well, let's just stick with our standard strategy. Remember, our main 3-point plan is bishop to b7. If we can go bishop to b4, bishop to b4, then often the move f5 when we can play f5. So, for example, let's see this in action. Knight to c3, bishop b7. And now, well, we've looked at ideas with d4. We go e6. And if white plays e4, well, we still go e6. And I had one game where I played as white. I had this with white. I played bishop to d3 here. I mean, again, if something like g3, we can either go f5 immediately here. And this is looking very comfortable for us. Bishop g2. Let's increase the pressure on e4. And I played f5 first because it's created a threat immediately. But at the right moment, I will play bishop to b4 and increase the pressure on e4. Now, I had this as white against Julian Hodgson. Let's just take a look at that game to finish off this segment on ideas you can use when white doesn't put his free pawns in the center. Now, Julian Hodgson is, well, he's now kind of retired from competitive chess. He was a very exciting player, Julian Hodgson. 2640, 2650, very attacking player, famous English player. And he was yet another generation of players who used this opening to great effect. And I tried a very strange setup with bishop to d3 against him. So in this position, let's think logically and give you a little bit of a test, okay? So over the course of the videos, I've given you ideas of what you should be playing. And it's not all about memorizing what you should do in certain positions. It's more about the ideas you should be playing. And if you can remember those main ideas, you should be able to put them into action when you play this opening in different situations. And for example, this position here could be a situation where you don't know the theory. So what should you play? Well, remember I said plan 1 was put the bishop on b7. Plan 2 was to put the bishop on b4. And now, after something like knight on ge2, you could try f5 straight away, but then things can get quite messy after e takes f5. Julian, first of all, simply played knight to e7. because he still wants to go f5, but when he plays this move, he wants to have the option of taking back on f5 with a piece or a pawn. I played bishop to c2 against Julian, trying to play my pawn to d4 next, and now f5. So here we go. See, logical play in action. Julian understood the ideas that he should be playing, so he played them. The crowbar move. The game continued castled. Julian castled. d4. And now, as we'll often see, you often should consider taking on c3 in these types of positions, and the bishop on b4 is not doing a great deal, so my opponent took on c3. This forces knight takes c3 in order to guard e4. And now my opponent swapped plans. He realized that he doesn't actually have too many threats against e4 here. So he played a very interesting plan, f4, and he used this pawn to attack me now. I tried to attack him, didn't quite work though. Queen g4, knight g6, knight to e2. I'm trying to win the pawn on f4, but now e5, and my position got very bad very quickly. So I have to admit the lines and variations in this video are a little bit more confusing than we've looked at previously. So let's just go back to start, have an overview for the ideas you should be thinking if faced with something you're not sure about. Now, my rule one is really you should wait until white plays c4 to play b6, but there are times when that's not possible, and your opponent can try to trick you in the move order here by playing g3. And if your opponent ever gets g3 in first, b6 makes little sense. But he hasn't played a move in the center of the board. So now I think a good response is c5, trying to take advantage of that. So we strike in the center now, because our typical English defense ideas don't work so well. If our opponent plays knight to f3, well, he hasn't played c4. So it's a very crafty move order idea, this. So b6 is okay, and you can play in the manners we spoke about, but it's not as effective in other lines. So you can play this way, and we talked a little bit about this, or if you want to, you can try the Dutch defense, and this might fit in very well to what we discussed. And one way you could try to play this is by going f5 and then playing b6 next and bishop b7, and that might get you into positions you're more comfortable with. So what if white plays c4 anyway, and after b6 he doesn't go e4? Well, if white doesn't play e4 in these positions, your plan is the same. Bishop b7, bishop b4 check, f5, when we are aiming to take control of the e4 square. And the only thing you have to think of is later on, do you aim to put your bishop on e4 or your knight on e4? If white fianchettos his kingside bishop, you always put your bishop on e4 after an exchange of the knight on b1. You don't want this knight on b1 taking your bishop. You have to exchange that knight off the board. If your opponent puts his light square bishop on f1, on e2 or d3, generally, after you've played your moves bishop b7, bishop b4, you want to put your knight on e4. Now, I know this is quite a complicated overview. I've hoped the ideas I've shown in this video have sort of shown you when these ideas are playable. Of course, when you're playing your natural games, it's actually, in my opinion, a good thing to think from an early stage. So many people nowadays, they learn what moves they should do against certain options of their opponent, and they don't think in a proper way. They play their moves without any thoughts behind them. When you're playing openings like this, I think they're really good for your chess because you have to think. You have to think logically. You have to think in more chess terms. You have to think outside the box, and you have to be flexible. So all in all, I think this opening will help you improve your chess, and I think you can get some very exciting positions from it. But remember, you have to be flexible, and you have to adjust to the setup the white plays. And that does conclude our videos here on the English defense. I really hope they come in handy for you. I wish you the best of luck playing them. I hope you get some great victories, not too many horrible defeats. We do all get them occasionally, but I hope you get some great victories with it. And most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the videos and they're useful to you. So thank you for now. My next set of videos should be on the French defense, which, as we discussed before, fits in very well with the move order we're using here.